you very much for inviting me.
Right. So we'll come back to talk about you and the REA in a moment. But for now, let's focus on Africa. The highlights and takeaway from this just concluded summit, how we must ensure that this is not just another conference, how we must ensure that this is not just another yearly event where African leaders come together to make promises they never fulfill. Mission 300 is about powering Africa. 2030 is just 5 years away, with nearly half of Africa's population living without electricity. How realistic is this goal?
Thank you very much. Just before answering your question, I just need to set some context. The Mission 300, like you rightly said, it's a collective initiative of the World Bank and African Development Bank to electrify 3 million people in sub-Saharan Africa before or by 2030. Now, that decision did not just come out of the blues. There were some data that resulted in taking that drastic decision. The World Bank commissioned a consulting company called Delbag and produced the Global Energy Access Report. And when you go to that report, you will see some key trends. First among them is, for the first time in 20 years, the number of people that are without electricity access increased. The past 20 years, that number keeps reducing. But recently, just last year, we realized that that number had increased to 685 million people that are without electricity access. And the second also data that was very glaring in that report is also the number of people that are living in underserved framework, or people that are living where the electricity grid is weak. That number also increased to about 1.6 billion people globally. Then the third also data that was also very glaring is, globally, the off-grid solution serve as the least cost or the most efficient way of providing electricity to these people that are without electricity access. Then thirdly, also, we realized that the global funding towards renewable energy increased in the last 5 years. That number increased from, I think, 15 billion to about 12, increased from 12.3 billion to 15.4 billion.
All right.
Then also, it was also realized that renewable energy, the share of renewable energy in the overall electricity mix, globally also increased. It increased from 16.7 to about 18.7%. So which literally shows the global acceptance of off-grid as a solution to address the electricity access and the role of the renewable energy. Now, it's based on this data that the two global banks realized that since most of these 685 million people that are without access are within the sub-Saharan Africa, let there be a coordinated and collective effort by the two banks, private sector, and the public sector, the leadership of these sub-Saharan African countries, towards driving a collective effort to address this electricity access gap, achieving 100% access by 2030.
All right, Mr. Ali. So the next question would be, is Africa ready? I mean, if the goal is to tackle one of the continent's most pressing challenges, achieving universal, reliable, and sustainable energy access by 2030. Listening to Ajay Banga, who is the president of the World Bank, it says the biggest challenge in the past has been the absence of all hands coming together to play. One part of that hand is the regulatory policy that is required to make it clear and transparent. Perhaps this should have been my first question. Is Africa ready?
Yes, I think I can speak of Nigeria. I was there at Tanzania, and I have seen the commitment of the leadership, the commitment of the private sector, the commitment of the two banks, even the financing arm of the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation. I've seen those commitments. And one of the things why the Tanzania or the Mission 300 is different is the fact that there is clarity in terms of what needs to be done to achieve the target of 100% access by 2030. For example, in Nigerian context, there are 5 key pillars that Nigeria signed and commit to working on those pillars to make sure that the country drive this electricity access by 2030. Each of these countries, to answer your question, signed this commitment, committing 1, to transform the electricity access, 2, to increase the electricity access rate of the country. In Nigerian context, we agreed that we were going to increase our the level at which we electrify the country from the current rate of 5% to 9%. So that is a clear commitment. Secondly, is also enhancing the financial viability of the electricity market. Thirdly, is starting to work towards regional integration. And this is, if we look at, for example, the South African power pool, whereby there are many of the South Africa or East African countries that are importing or exporting electricity at a very competitive rate. So Nigeria needs to also start to look into that using the West African power pool, open its market, connect to other West African countries, import or export electricity as a way to enhance.
Mr. Ali, we'll come back home in a minute, but let's stay with Africa, because going by my last conversation with a professor of energy electricity law, he thinks that addressing African energy problems cannot be done without significant doses of local financing. Where does Africa stand today in terms of resources and energy mix?
Still taking the Nigerian context as an example, I think Nigeria is leading in that regard. For example, the President Ahmed Bola Tinubu, one of the first things after signing the Electricity Act he did is the approving of the distributed access through renewable energy scale-up funding, a $750 million funding, which is the biggest public sector funding in sub-Saharan Africa. So Nigeria, in that regard, we understand the need for this financing, and not only just small financing, but a large-scale financing to address this electricity access gap. Not only that, we design a program that, apart from this $750 million public funding, we design a program that will require us to catalyze a private sector funding of about $1.1 billion. One of the key outcomes of the Tanzanian summit is the signing of $70 million financing by the 4 Nigerian local renewable energy service companies, signing it as a debt financing to come and start this process of deploying infrastructure to address the electricity access challenge. So from Nigerian context, we understand the need of the public financing, and we signed the biggest public financing in sub-Saharan Africa. We understand the need of the private financing. We developed a means whereby the Nigerian and international players, renewable energy service company operating within the country, have access to not only debt but equity and grant, and that has been crystallized. You can see that not only the International Financing Corporation funding of 70 million, even the Nigerian local banks are providing a pool of resources in terms of dollar financing and local financing to this renewable energy service company. We have also seen the need of partnering with the international development agencies like United Nations Development Program, United Nations International Industrial Development Organization, to also catalyze grant funding that will be used in addressing this electricity access challenge. So in Nigerian context, we understood all this and already were put in place a means to harness these resources.
So with Nigeria's, Mr. President's commitment to achieving universal energy access by 2030, emphasizing the government's target of increasing renewable energy to constitute 50% of the national energy mix, Nigeria still relies on hydro and gas for power. And for some experts, they believe Nigeria is yet to fully tap into renewable energy options. How is this limiting the country's potential?
So part of the pillars the country signed, like I mentioned, with Nigeria's electricity access compacts that was signed by Mr. President at Tanzania, has 5 pillars. And each of these pillars has specific action plan that needs to be done to address the electricity access challenge. And like you rightly said, one of the pillars is for Nigeria to enhance investment to tap into the gas resources, for the country to unlock these gas resources, being the fact that the country, most of the generation capacity is a thermal base for the country to address the electricity access challenge. So there is that commitment of building that. I'm an off-grid person, but what I know is that that's one of the pillars signed by Mr. President, is committing to channel resources to tap into the gas resources for us to enhance our generation using the thermal resources. But practically, there is the last mile commitment, one of the pillars, which is to address the electricity access in the rural areas, which most of the electricity deficit is within these rural areas. So there is that commitment of reviewing the regulation, as Ajay Banga mentioned in his speech. It's not only about funding, but changing some regulation policy to catalyze this in private sector investment, for the private sector to have the confidence that if I bring my funding, I'll be able to realize my funds and returns. So one of the pillars that also Mr. President signed is committing to change the mini grid regulation in the country, where currently the mini grid regulation has a cap of only 1 megawatt, but there is a need to increase that cap from 1 megawatt to maybe 5 or 10 or whatever the regulator think that it's most appropriate for the country. Reason being that the larger the capacity, the more willing the private sector is to bring in the funding and deploy large-scale mini-grid infrastructure to address the electricity access gap. So that is one of the commitments under the pillars signed by Mr. President.
All right, before we come to your agency, let me take you up on affordability. There have been, several arguments to substantiate that availability and affordability are interrelated, so that if a government decides to maintain energy prices below cost with a view to making energy more affordable to the poorest households, please help us justify that position.
Well, for the off-grid sector, there is a very strategic framework devised by the current government to make sure that what is being generated within these rural areas is affordable. And that is de-risking the sector. One of the reasons why these rural areas do not have access to this electricity is the fact that the private sector are unwilling to go to these rural areas because, one, the consumption is always very low, and two, because of the perception of ability to pay, the affordability perception. So what the federal government did is to now de-risk that sector and incentivize the private sector to go to these rural communities, to use their resources, deploy the infrastructure, and address the electricity access gap. And the federal government directs that sector by providing capital grants to these public private sectors using a result-based framework. whereby the private sector identified these rural areas, resource their own funding, either in form of debt, equity, or grant, deploy this infrastructure and get a capital grant from the federal government to use that in defraying the cost of deploying that infrastructure. And we have seen that working in one of the projects that this government implemented that is called the Nigerian Electrification Project. We have seen the deployment of over 200 mini-grids, some of them very large-scale mini-grid of 1 megawatt being deployed in different communities. And the question about the affordability, it may interest you to know that payment rate within our off-grid ecosystem has been more than 90%. So the ability or the affordability is there, and we have seen where these mini-grids are deployed, catalyzing socio-economic activities within the rural areas, giving these rural communities the means to afford to pay for the electricity. I give you an example in a community in Nasarawa, which has been a landmark example that we have seen. We did a demand load analysis before the deployment of the mini grid, and we realized that their consumption level is between 200 to 260 kilowatt, and we deploy about 320 kilowatt of mini grid, and within a very short period of time, the demand within that community had increased significantly to the level that we were doubting whether our initial assessment of the demand of the community was wrong. But when we went there, we now realized a new productive use of equipment, businesses that emerge within those community, which answered the question that electricity catalyzes economic activities in rural areas.
Mr. Ali, you would agree with me that whether or not Nigerians can afford it is left for Nigerians to say. But let's talk about the agency. Last Friday, you became the substantive managing director of the Rural Electrification Agency, as announced by the presidency. Before now, you've been acting as the agency's managing director since March 2024. I mean, I can imagine the limitations that come with operating in an acting capacity. But now that you're the substantive managing director, what are your goals?
Very simple. The main mandate of Rural Electrification Agency is to create electricity access, provide access to unserved and underserved communities. Unserved, those are the rural areas that are without this access completely, and underserved are those communities that falls on the band of D and E, those that get very limited supply of electricity. So the first goal is being audacious to increase our level of penetration, electrifying 25 million Nigerians in the next 3 years using the different programs that we are implementing. One of key program is the one I mentioned, the distributed access through renewable energy scale-up, which we aim to electrify 17.5 million Nigerians. And we have a new landmark program that is called eHeart, energizing health, education, rural communities, using our Rural Electrification Fund, where we aim to provide access to about 2.5 million Nigerians. Then we have other programs that we are designing working with the African Development Bank under the Desert to Power program that we want to also energize about 25 million Nigerians. So the first target is to provide access to 25 million Nigerians. The second level of it is to continue to intervene in different critical sectors of the Nigerian economy. If you look at what the Rural Electrification Agency has been doing, is intervening in the health sector, education sector, and the agricultural sector. And we intend to continue to provide that. Just now, I keep on mentioning, we just provide hybrid mini grid in 7 universities and 2 teaching hospitals, one of which is the one here in Abuja, that we deploy a 3 megawatt mini grid providing electricity 24/7 to the universities, lecture rooms, lecturers' quarters, and the entire university. Another one is University of Maiduguri, a 12 megawatt providing electricity to the university teaching hospital. So that is one area of our intervention. And the second one is the first event I did after being confirmed is signing 23 agreement with private sector to deploy mini grids in selected agricultural hub areas. One of the critical factors affecting agriculture in Nigeria is post-harvest losses, and providing electricity can easily address that challenge. So this is the second point. The third is to come up with the National Electrification Strategy and Implementation Plan. And this is to have one coordinated approach of addressing electricity access in the whole country. The Electrification Act that was signed by Mr. President last year has opened the entire value chain, giving opportunities to subnational private sector to come and participate in the entire electricity value chain. But that will require us